My pleasure to introduce Dr. RogerTeal from Demand Trans Solutions. Roger has had the instruction to challenge and provoke this morning, and he's going to talk to us about market data, knowledge, and delivering in the role of a taxi regulator.
Good morning. Some of you may know me. Most of you don't look like very familiar faces. I've been working in this field for literally 35 years now. So I've seen a great deal of evolution of the taxi industry, much less evolution of the regulatory approach to the taxi cab industry, which hopefully was something that's going to be changing in the near future. And I was involved with sort of analyzing much of the information that had to do with deregulation of the taxi industry back in the 1980s. So I'm very familiar with the economic regulatory framework for taxi cabs as well as other transportation modes. And that's really going to be sort of my focus here, is more on the, not the theory of economic regulation, but trying to put some of this into the context of economic regulation, which is not to say that safety regulation or concerns about sort of the public service aspects of taxis is not important for regulators, but my focus today is really going to be more on the economic regulation of the industry and the framework for that. Ray has really helped set the stage by going through a number of things that I think are important background for understanding that. And so what I'd like to do today is go through two or three things. One of them is to sort of indicate to you that I see you have some significant challenges that are posed by the changes in technology. One of those changes was the focus of a great deal of discussion yesterday, which was taxi apps. And the other is this whole proliferation of data, which has become available recently, within the last several years, in huge volumes and in very inexpensive form. It's digital, you can get it easily. We have a few regulators. I'll make a note about the city of Los Angeles here, who have extensive data delivery requirements for the organizations that they regulate, which they are using to their advantage. So this is really changing the nature of what you as regulators have to confront with. As I indicated, regulatory frameworks have stayed the same in this industry for literally decades. There was the deregulation movement in the 1980s. That came and went, as Ray indicated. It was unsuccessful. There's been a reversion back to regulation, even in the cities that did deregulate, and there weren't that many of them. There's been some recent extension of regulation to driver lease rates in the past decade in a handful of cities, as those lease rates became, contentious in terms of the local political process, because they rose such a level that drivers were having a great deal of difficulty making any money. But that's really been the biggest change in regulation in the last decades, or those two developments, one of which came and went. So, as I say, there's two challenges that U.S. regulators face today. One is posed by the taxi apps, and the other is posed by all the data that's now available. Because, as Ray indicated, it's no longer acceptable to be a regulator of an industry with the data record that has been so typical of the regulatory approach in the taxi cab industry. It just isn't acceptable. And I'm going to take you through a case study a little bit. It's in more detail in my paper, but I'm going to give you a little flavor of it here as to what you can do as a regulator with a richer data set. I also think it's really, really important to preface this discussion with this background, which is the last point. That, as I said, I've been looking at this industry for 35 years. This is an industry that has literally disintegrated. We heard some talk yesterday about full-service taxi companies and taxi fleets. And from my perspective, much of that is illusory. This is not an industry that has unitary organizations. It's split up into 3 or 4 entities, and I'm going to come back to that in the latter part of my presentation. And if you're not willing to grapple with that, it becomes very, very difficult to make really intelligent regulatory decisions. So I think that's a really important background that prefaces everything we talk about. So what are the objectives of taxicab regulation? Bill Rouse from LA Yellow Cab yesterday, when he got up here, and he was standing in for the TLPA, but he's also one of the best operators in the country. I think he put his finger on it precisely. It's all about supply versus demand. You as the regulator are responsible for bringing supply and demand into a balance in the marketplace. If the marketplace on its own could achieve that balance, you wouldn't be necessary, as Dr. Monday said. But it's not. Experience has shown that it just doesn't work that way. So your job is to bring supply and demand into balance by your regulatory decisions, sort of almost the beginning and end of your role. Now that's easy to say, high level, much harder to accomplish in terms of specific decisions. So when you do that then, consumers will obtain responsiveness, coverage, and value for price. Producers will achieve a sufficient financial return and will have accountability for both the producers and the consumers in the form of some sort of audit trail of what happened and some sort of locus of responsibility if something goes wrong. That's your job as regulators, is to make sure that that happens. At that point, let the market play itself out. Once you put those parameters in place, then make it feasible. So, historically, regulation in the taxi industry has been very data poor. There's a couple acronyms up there, ICC and CAB, which you probably don't even know what they mean because it's been so long since those organizations were in existence. The first is the Interstate Commerce Commission. The second is the Civil Aeronautics Board. We used to regulate the railroads, the trucking industry, and the airlines in this country. But in the late 70s and early 80s, that all went away. Those organizations, when they were in existence, had regulatory proceedings all the time. And the record before those organizations was huge in terms of data, voluminous. No decisions were made by those organizations that were not data-driven. But in the taxi cab industry, that has not historically been the case. Our decisions have been on a very data-poor situation. There's reasons for that. The primary reason being that the data didn't exist, or to get it was a costly, time-consuming process. So very few regulators developed systemic systems for capturing data because it was expensive to do that. Now that's changed, but few regulators still have taken advantage of that. As I indicate, the city of Los Angeles is one that has, but and I'm not saying that there aren't others, but that's just sort of a poster child for it. But most regulators haven't done that. So, and also let's be clear, the industry hasn't been dynamic. It's sort of been a pretty steady state industry. There's been internal organizational changes, but in terms of its approach to the market, it's been relatively status quo. So most regulators have not had any strong reason to be other than reactive. And they haven't been proactive in understanding these supply-demand relationships. But technology has changed all of that. It's changed the data landscape. I've listed up here a number of pieces of data that can now be obtained more or less for free by the dispatch systems, by the smart meters, by the credit card terminals. All of this information is available for essentially no cost if you can get your taxi cab operators to provide it to you, which that is part of your job as as regulators, is to make sure that they do provide it to you. So this information, which is voluminous, really changes the way in which you can understand the market. So you can have a comprehensive view of what's going on in the local taxi market. And here's some things that I've listed. I mean, I could list more things, but you can understand things about taxi utilization and availability. How much are these vehicles being utilized? Do you have vehicles sitting around doing nothing much of the day, i.e. oversupply? Or do you have service shortages, people calling and not getting a cab, not because the cabs aren't responding, because drivers want to sit at the airport or major hotels, but because literally they're all engaged in service. You can determine how profitable drivers are, and you can break down that profitability by what type of, how they're serving the market. You can determine how the companies are doing. There's a whole host of things that with this data you can now do. You can be in the same position as a Wall Street analyst who's covering United or American Airlines and looking at their quarterly results and determining whether this airline is doing well or poorly and making investment decisions on that basis. Those analysts, in a certain sense, are regulating the flow of capital to those airlines in the same way that you as regulators are trying to regulate how the conduct of the marketplace functions. So you now have the ability to do exactly the same thing as very sophisticated financial analysts do. So what I'm going to do now is take you in the next couple minutes through some data that has been generated and it's in the paper, and I've got about a dozen copies of the paper if anybody wants it, for a small city on the West Coast adjacent to a large city where recently I did a regulatory study with another consultant. And this shows you what the possibilities are with this rich data sets. So there are 3 companies that serve this city. You can see the breakdown of how much each one of the work each one is doing. You can see that company X is the dominant company. Company Z, you might wonder why it's even in the market. You can see how the trips break down in the radio dispatch market. Again, company X completely dominates. Company Z might as well not be there. So already I know much more about the functioning of the market than I would with the typical data that regulators are working with just by this very high level breakdown of data. Here I can see how these companies specialize in the market. Companies Y and Z are basically cab stand companies. And by the way, this is not a market where the companies can hang out at the airport. They can deliver to the airport, which is a large regional airport, but they can't pick up there except on request. So it's not like they go to the airport and can sit in the taxi queue. So the cab stand markets that these folks are hanging out at are big hotels and downtown cab stands. So 2 of the 3 companies basically are barely serving the telephone order market, and 1 company basically not at all. Here's an interesting piece of information. This is the percentage of taxis that are engaged at any point in time during the day. So every 15 minutes, we could determine whether a taxi was engaged, had somebody in the vehicle, or had been dispatched for a trip, or is just sitting with nothing to do. You can see here that during the working day, at least half of all the vehicles authorized to serve the city are available, either doing nothing. So do we have enough capacity in this market? Yeah, I think so. Even in the evenings, and the reason the thing changes in the evenings is the supply goes down. It's not that demand goes up. There's plenty of taxis available. And yet, one of the taxis wants an increase in the number of vehicles it has in the city. And by the way, the city knew nothing about this information before we did the study. And they were asking, well, gee, do we need more taxis in our city? Here's the productivity of the taxi cabs. You can see that they're not that productive. In a well-patronized taxi market, you should be able to maybe get 1.5 trips an hour out of a taxi cab. 2 of the 3 companies here don't even get to a single trip an hour. So we have substantial differences within the productivity of the industry. Here's the driver compensation. Again, to Dr. Mundy's point, there's significant difference between compensation in the upper portion of the taxi, driver world and the bottom portion of it. These people are working lots of hours a week to make that money. Again, none of this information was known by the city prior to this study, yet it was all available. There was no heroic measures that were needed to obtain this information. It was simple, well, simple, but straightforward data analysis type of stuff. So what were the policy implications of all that? That service was very, very good in the market, that the taxi cab rate levels were completely adequate. Again, there was concern maybe we should be raising the fares because the drivers aren't making enough money. The taxi organizations are getting acceptable financial returns, although the dominant providers probably be disadvantaged by the fact that we have so many cabs in the market. And that really, there should be a reduction in the size of the industry, that the public is not well served by the industry at its current size. It puts upward pressure on rates. It injures the dominant company, which is the one that's providing the backbone of service to the market. And in fact, they should get rid of taxis in this market, but that's a really tough thing to do from regulatory aspects. So I've listed here a number of the benefits of data-driven regulation. Clearly, you can understand the supply and demand situation. You can understand that if supply is excessive, that you need to do something about it. If the market is failing to provide sufficient service, you need to do something about it. So there's a number of things that you can do with data-driven analysis that you're not going to be able to do by just this high-level, broad brush information that's typically available in regulatory proceedings. So I'd like to then, in closing, to bring your attention to two problems that I perceive that data-driven analysis can help regulators begin to grapple with. One is what I call the oversupply syndrome. And it's spelled out in more detail in the paper. But essentially what it means is that if you have too much supply, you're going to, what's the opposite of a virtuous circle? It's the opposite of a virtuous circle. It's a downward circle, that you've got a problem. And you need to try to figure out how to get your supply under control. But as regulators, that's something that you're not easily able to do. You said company X can have 50 permits, company Y has 100 permits. Now you have 150 vehicles serving the market. How do you take that? How do you deal with that when 150 is 30% too many? So capacity reduction works really well in the airline industry. It's returned them to profitability. But it's very hard in the taxi industry. And the second thing that I'd like to bring your attention to is what I call the loosely coupled taxi organization problem. Taxi organizations, from my perspective, don't really exist. They're fiction. Taxi organizations are a group of loosely coupled entities that sort of work together. They're a marriage of convenience. They're not a single organization. When you introduce taxi apps into a system of loosely coupled organizations, it sort of begins to make clear what the weaknesses of that system are. Because taxi apps would have no opportunity whatsoever to get a foothold into this market if it was not for the fact that the alignment of the actors within this set of loosely coupled relationships are not already advantageous for all the actors. So as you begin to grapple with the implication of these taxi apps, I would strongly urge you not to merely listen to the rhetoric of the taxi industry about how this stuff works. It's very important for you to do your own analysis, to really understand the economics of your local industry in terms of grappling with the implications of that. So again, this is all spelled out in more detail in the paper. If you want a copy of it, just come and see me afterwards. Thank you.
Thanks for the presentation, Doctor. I just want to ask about oversupply issue,
right,
because really we did the same analysis, but really we stuck on issue that maybe there is 40 to 50% of the total fleet working, But taking a decision for oversupply, I think, is critical, as it has to be correlated with the waiting time and distribution of service. Sometimes maybe it's not working just 40 to 50 utilization, but at the end there is some location is not served well. And also maybe the waiting time is high, so I think we have to take this.
Absolutely, and I didn't have time to show you, but in this market, the average waiting time was 4 minutes. That's right, 4 minutes was the average response time. 98% of all trips were picked up within 20 minutes. There was no response time problem in this market. But you're absolutely right. That's something that you have to look at, but the dispatch data will enable you to determine what the situation is.